Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk. On this week's show, I'm very excited to welcome Plymouth Police Chief and Director of Public Safety, Mike Goldstein. Chief Goldstein and I talk about what it's like to lead a police department, why he's opted for the amount of transparency that he has, and what the past few weeks have been like for him given his role on this week's Who the Folk podcast. Chief Mike Goldstein, welcome to the Who the Folk podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity to be on with you today.
Oh, thank you. So, for starters, and I asked this question recognizing that even though we are near Minneapolis and Plymouth, where I live as well, so in the interest of full disclosure, we are not in Minneapolis, but over the past few weeks, how has it been for you given your profession and the scrutiny that it has come under recently?
Well, Lonnie, that is a loaded question. My emotions have ranged from anger to frustration to being disheartened to, somewhat just almost being at a loss, like, when will this nightmare come to an end? Whether, we're talking specifically about the George Floyd incident that has unleashed all of this civil unrest or even COVID-19 for that matter. But, in that vein, you can dwell in the negative and that's really not going to get you anywhere. So, you have to find a way to move forward. And we have had other, I'll call them watershed moments in the past. I've been in law enforcement for more than 30 years now, and I can think back to a number of incidents over the course of time, whether it's Rodney King in LA, whether it's 9/11 or Ferguson or Philando Castile. There have been other incidents that have caused us to take pause and to find, new ways forward. And I was really pleased isn't the right word, but I was satisfied to a degree as to some of the progress that has been made within law enforcement circles since Ferguson. And I was looking forward to, really seeing what sort of outcomes we would be generating through the good work that has, been done since that time. And all of that has come to a screeching halt. So, again, as I said, you can dwell in the negative or you can find a way to move forward. And that's what I've chosen to do. And it's coincidental, I guess, maybe. I wrote a long message to our organization today talking about how proud I am of all of them because we're not being consumed with the negativity. We are trying to find the silver lining, and it's going to take a lot of hard work and effort, but it's going to be worth it to reestablish the credit that we once had with the greater community. To showcase our talents and to find ways to, serve everybody within our collective communities with, equity and fairness. And I believe that, we have done a really good job here in our organization, but there's always room for improvement. So we take the challenges, we turn them into opportunities, and we look for new successes to be generated in partnership with those who we serve.
Speaking of your writings, you had written a letter that was posted on the city's Facebook page and was sent out to the community, to those of us on the city's email list, where you spent a lot of, it's a long letter and really interesting. And you spent a lot of time detailing things like how officers are selected and trained and the concern of their wellness and community mental health resources as well, among other things. Why was it so important to you and maybe even to the credibility of the department as a whole to make something like that so public, to sort of show your work?
Well, there's many components to this piece that was published. Truth be told, it was actually written 3 years ago or more, with the death of Philando Castile. When that was published, it was in response to an email inquiry that I received from a resident wanting to know how I could assure her that her family would not be killed by one of our officers if they were ever stopped by the police. And I was, taken aback by that, and thought, geez, how could somebody just assume that if they had an interaction with us that, we would intentionally harm someone? So I offered almost verbatim everything that was written into what you've just described. And at the beginning of it, though, I said, what you are asking is weighty, it's profound, and it deserves something more than an email response. Therefore, I invited her to a telephone conversation or to a in-person meeting, and she accepted the opportunity to meet face-to-face, which we did. And I'm really, really proud of what transpired. Since that first interaction, we have stayed connected, and we actually have this community collaboration group, which is comprised of African American residents in our community and some adjoining communities. And we meet every other month, either in person and now via Zoom, to have hard conversations about what's going on in society. And we've done some really cool work. We produced a video that we were getting ready to showcase throughout our communities as it relates to kind of walking in someone else's shoes or looking at different perspectives of how communities see the police and vice versa. And then, of course, COVID came along and we weren't able to have group meetings to kind of dialogue our way through what the video represents. And then, of course, now we have this civil unrest. So the sentiments, again, almost verbatim, are older. However, they're universally true as it relates to our department. So after the George Floyd incident, I felt that it was important to find the right time. I didn't do it, within days. It took a week or two to put this out. And I wanted to acknowledge my sorrow for his death. And I wanted our community to know and understand that our police department has certain foundational measures that we do not take for granted, that we reinforce all of the time through our conversations, our training, our supervision, our methods of accountability, to offer our community the best service that we can. And so we're grateful for the support that we receive, but again, we don't take it for granted. And it's all about making deposits. I stole this phrase from the Mayo Clinic. They talk about providing their patients uncommon service. And so for the last many years, our officers can tell you, probably how tired they are of hearing me say this, but that we're going to provide the community uncommon service. And we have different metrics to kind of showcase that. So it was really important for, again, not to repeat myself completely, for the community to understand all of the different facets that we take into account when we onboard a new officer, when we train them, all of the things that we do train them in. And very few of them are new. We have been doing these things literally for decades. This whole discussion about de-escalation, that's not a new concept. Good cops have done that forever. I mean, it's the art of the deal. It's about, negotiating with people, exercising influence verbally. 95% of what we do is done, verbally. And, last year alone in Plymouth, we had 65,000 contacts with the public. I'm rounding up, but it was almost 65,000 different contacts with the public. And of all those contacts, there were 45 incidents where force was used. And when we describe force, it is everything from escorting someone once they've been handcuffed into a squad car, to, maybe potentially taking someone to the ground to get them handcuffed, or potentially using, a chemical agent to, calm their behavior and to get them under control. But force is rarely used. Much of what we do is done just in person, talking with people and generating cooperation. And moreover, very few people, don't cooperate, right? When we show up, people are generally, they abide by what we're asking them to do. And most of what we do is service related. It's not crime enforcement. We provide a lot of services to the community because we're the only 24/7 social service agency that's available. So when someone's having a medical emergency, we're the ones that, respond. When someone's having problems with their car on the side of the road, we're the ones that respond. When someone's having a dispute with their spouse and a neighbor calls in, they hear some arguing, we're the ones that respond. So the note to the community was basically, this is who we are, this is what we do, this is how we do it, and why. And it was an invitation to dialogue further if people wanted to.
And a lot of the thing, let me go back for a sec. One of the things that really interested me in what you just said was that this is a 3+ year-old letter. This isn't new. And the idea of de-escalation and the, sort of that concept of, what's being discussed now as a new thing in policing. These are things that you have preached in Plymouth. It sounds like most of the 16 years you've been chief there for.
Yeah.
Why is it that it seems that you and Plymouth are so ahead of the curve on this discussion, where others just seem to have discovered it over the course of the last few months?
I think in order to defend the profession a bit, most of us get it, right? Most of us are a lot further along than maybe people give us credit for, because people don't see bad things happening. So they just assume that things are okay and they're not paying very close attention. But when things go awry, like what we saw in Minneapolis and in other places throughout the country, then people start asking questions. And the culture there is very different than here. And I'm not here to Monday morning quarterback something that I'm not directly a part of. But I'm very proud of what we have established and what many other progressive organizations have established. When I look to, those who have mentored me and other law enforcement leaders throughout the country that I respect and have studied and have learned from, I'm really not capable of any original thought. I'm really good at, kind of seeing what others do and trying to implement it here. And it goes back to, this common notion of, treat people the way you want to be treated and do the right thing. I mean, those are very simple concepts, yet they're not easy to exercise. And so we work very hard on training our personnel to how to properly interact with folks, offering that uncommon service. And a lot of what we do is based on this platform that was put out in 2015 through the work of President Obama. And I'm not making any sort of political statements by this, but there was, we can't ignore what happened in Ferguson. We can't ignore what happened with some of the other incidents that happened throughout the country and certainly here in Minnesota. And, the president called together a group of academics and law enforcement executives from throughout the country. And they put together this 21st century policing platform that one cannot deny has merit and value. And really, if you dig into the details of the process and of the platform, there's not a whole lot there that's novel. What it was, in my opinion, is a call to action. And it was a wake-up call for those who had their heads in the sand. We have a lot of organizations out throughout the country that do superior work as it relates to law enforcement and policing. And this was sort of the kind of bringing in sort of the best practices. and making recommendations and almost setting a common denominator for those resistors to try to achieve, right? A lot of departments already exceed what is stipulated in that 21st century policing platform, but there's still some that are finding their way. We're one of very few departments that I'm aware of, at least here in Minnesota, that actually showcase, on our website where we are at with the 21st century policing platform. I mean, there are measurements that we can show the community as to where we are, what we're doing, and how we're doing it within the pillars of that document. So, that was an important piece that I think differentiates us. But again, there are a number of very progressive, constructive, and good organizations that exist, but they just don't get the credit that they deserve because they're number one, they're not seeking attention. And number two, they're not creating typically, I mean, anything can happen, but typically speaking, they're not creating incidents that are drawing attention to themselves, right? I mean, because things generally go well.
Right. And it's an interesting thing, the level of transparency that you have in showcasing the 21st century policing, the metrics on your website and where you are in relation to those. That's a choice that you've made to be transparent. Why do so in such a public way?
Well, I mean, when you look at what we do, there's nothing up our sleeves. I mean, and I don't know why there was ever. Well, I guess I do understand why there's this misnomer as far as the secrets that go on behind closed doors within law enforcement organizations. Because there is that code of silence issue in some organizations and in different places across the country. And there is some mystery to how investigations get done. Listen, we've got nothing to hide. If we're investigating an active and open case, well, there are things that through state statute we are not allowed to speak to. I mean, in order to protect everybody involved. But beyond an ongoing and active investigation, there's very, very little, unless we're talking about security data as it relates to protecting the homeland and some other classifications within law that allows us to keep information private or confidential. Again, those are rare instances. And for the most part, everything that we do, it's public. So why not share it? I mean, we have nothing to hide. The women and men who work here are, everyday citizens who made the choice to become a police officer. They weren't recruited. They weren't coerced into this job. They've made the choice. And having made that choice, there's certain standards and obligations that they have to live up to, both on duty and off duty. And so, they're just civic-minded individuals who want to do what's right. And they enjoy providing a certain level of service to the community. What's to hide about that? And so, for us, if you want to take a closer look, we invite you to come to our Citizens Academy, come to our community conversations, participate in our, over 500 different community engagement activities that we did last year alone. Be involved, be available to ask questions, and we're happy to answer them.
One of the things that's become kind of a buzzword right now in the wake of the last few weeks after George Floyd's killing is the concept of defunding the police. When you hear that as a police chief, as a longtime police officer, you've been in the force for 30 years now in Plymouth. What does that mean to you when you hear people outside, citizens, for example, talking about that?
Well, and I don't mean to be crass,
no,
but I think it's nonsense. If we don't do this job, who is? And I know that in San Francisco and in Albuquerque, they're looking at different public safety models and sending social workers and other skilled professionals into managing certain incidents within their communities. And that's all fine and well. Truth be told, Minneapolis has a co-responder model where they have social workers responding to incidents where someone in their community might be struggling with a mental health concern. We have that here in the suburbs as well. But I can tell you that there are plenty of circumstances whereby you would be sending a civilian, maybe not trained in defending themselves or others, potentially into harm's way to handle what might seem as a routine incident and ultimately evolves into something that is not so routine. And, people need to understand that those of us in law enforcement, particularly those of us, here in Minnesota, whereby it's a bit unique. We're the only state in the union that requires a college degree for its police officers. Our academy training is second to none. The training that goes on in most of the organizations throughout the community, throughout the state, is top notch. We have licensing requirements where we have to have a number of continuing educational credits each year, and people don't necessarily realize or understand that. We're trained to wear many, many different hats, and we need to be able to change the hat depending on the circumstance that we're contending with. So to defund the police, I wish you luck, because without our services, one of the potential end results will be anarchy. And I don't believe that most taxpayers within the various communities throughout the state and beyond are interested in that. We provide a service that, some might argue we might be extending into situations where we shouldn't be. Okay, let's talk about that. Let's have that conversation. Maybe when instead of defunding, they use another word called dismantling. Okay, well, what does that mean? Are we restructuring? Are we changing requirements? Are we looking at, bringing in other professionals to assist in what we do? All those things should be on the table. All those things should be, up for consideration. Camden, New Jersey, they disbanded their police department a few years ago and started from scratch. And what they have now is very different from what they had before. And you can throw all the money you want at training. You can talk about dismantling. You can do all of these different things. But again, defunding notwithstanding, all of these other things that you do, if you don't have a healthy and functional culture, all these other things aren't going to matter. And so when you look at Minneapolis, they already had in policy the duty to intervene and to report. But it doesn't do any good that it's in written form, it's been trained to, but no one's following up on it in the field, right? So it's about culture. And that is where leadership and good followership comes into play. And so if you want to affect change, and if you want to bring law enforcement into the 21st century, into this new era of policing, there are good ways to do it, but to defund it and hope that it goes away, that's just a ridiculous notion to me. And there's nothing anyone could ever say or do to convince me otherwise. It's just something that not only shouldn't happen, I don't believe it ever will happen.
Now, you just said the magic word there, which is culture. And it was exactly the thing I was going to pivot to, and you segued it perfectly. It sounds like, based in what you've written and what you've put out on the website, and you talk about the number of hours of training that the officers are required every year as opposed to just every 3 years under normal regulations, that you've built a different kind of culture than you might find at a lot of other departments. And is that something that exists because it is in the suburbs and the challenges of a suburban city and suburban department are very different than a urban one like Minneapolis or St. Paul? Or is it something that can be replicated in a bigger city?
It can be replicated. Absolutely. It's about priorities. It's about funding. It's about modeling, role modeling, strong supervision, strong accountability, removing some of the leverage that unions have. They have a place I firmly believe that, but that place is limited in scope. And ultimately, leaders need to be able to remove folks from the force when warranted without a third-party arbitrator bringing them back into service. It undermines the culture. It undermines what the leadership is trying to achieve. So it can be replicated, yes. And is our environment unique? Not necessarily. The suburbs are a great place to work. People generally support what we do. We have, really, strong support from our elected officials. We have all the tools we could ever really need or want. We receive, a fair compensation and good benefits, and it's a good place to work. And in order for us to carry out our mission, this is an old military adage, we have to take care of our troops. So for me, my number one priority, which I've been criticized publicly before, is when people say, well, what's your number one priority? The expected answer from a police chief would be, well, the community, safeguarding the community. And for me, that's not true. My number one priority is to take care of our women and men, getting them everything that they need and most everything that they want, caring for their physical, mental, and spiritual health, giving them the training that's going to afford them success in the field. And when you do that, they then carry out the mission of the organization. They're the ones that are, creating fans within the field. And that is how you generate success. So, like you pointed out, the state requires X amount, I think 48 hours of continuing education every 3 years to maintain our license. And we blow that out of the water. Each of our officers receives on average about 130 hours of training each year. Because we treat training as a priority. Training and education are paramount to our success. And so we look for ways to do that effectively, being cost efficient, but also, giving our folks, retooling their skill set as often as we can.
And again, back to culture, sort of like transparency being a choice, it would seem to me that building the kind of culture that you have helped, if not start, certainly continue since you became chief, that's a choice too. You can choose to, run a department that way, or you could choose a lot of other ways. It sounds like that probably won't be as, it probably would be more harmful to both officers and the community. Like, it feels like you found a balance that maybe more departments could learn from.
Yeah, I'm grateful. We have a great team. We scrutinize who we bring on very, very carefully. I'm surrounded by people more talented than me. And together, nothing is really done in a vacuum. We work collectively to establish the goals we want to achieve, and we give people the freedom to achieve those goals. We actually have signs up in the department that say, if it's not illegal, immoral, unethical, or against policy, make it happen. We hire people for their ingenuity, for their creativity, for their talents, and they understand the boundaries that they need to kind of stay within, but go forward and solve problems. Go forward and make a positive difference. And I don't want to get in your way. Don't ask for permission necessarily for everything that you need to do, because that's only going to delay your effectiveness. And so again, it is culture, and it is maybe a little unique to us. But again, I've learned from some great people over the course of my career, and I'm instituting what I think has offered them success. If it works for them, well, it should work for us. And the more I learn, the more we tweak and continue to try to find ways to evolve and improve and bring in, new ways of doing things. I wrote, again, in the piece today to our department, because, again, they've heard me recite this numerous times. Each year I bring it up at our annual department meeting. There's two different quotes, and neither of which are mine. But change is inevitable and growth is optional. And if you don't like change, you'll like irrelevance even less. So as the social contract changes throughout society, and again, some of the change concerns me greatly as far as how far this thing could swing. But we know that the social contract is changing. We're going to have to be amenable to that and kind of alter some of our courses of direction in order to keep people, happy in some respects, but and also to be able to provide them the safety and security they need and that they appreciate living in our community.
One of the things that I left out when I introduced you was your title. It's not just police chief, but it's also director of public safety. Is that a common situation to have both of those titles?
No, not really. It ebbs and flows. It's somewhat popular in different parts of the country, but and our history here is kind of unique. When the police department and the fire department were first started, almost 60 years ago, there were two independent departments, one for police, one for fire. And then in the 80s, they were combined into one public safety department where, again, from an operational perspective, firefighters fought fires and the police officers responded to calls, police calls. But organizationally, they were combined for budgetary purposes, for oversight and training purposes. And then around 2000, 2001, they separated for various reasons into two independent departments. And then back in 2015, so 5 years ago, the city council chose to reconfigure things and create one public safety department. So we had one voice speaking for all of the emergency services that we offer to the community, because our community was growing so rapidly and there were a lot of strategic decisions that needed to be made in order to facilitate the functions we're to provide. So they asked if I would assume that role. I had been the police chief since 2004. So 11 years into it, they said, "Hey, we want to add this other duty to you. We're gonna give you the fire department as well." And I'm grateful for that, because we've been able to do some pretty cool things with our fire department to get them up to speed and to provide the level of service that a city like ours deserves. So, yeah, it's a bit unique. Primarily here in Minnesota, there's a few public safety departments that are out there, but most are separate police and fire departments.
So, how do you distinguish between the two titles in your job? When are you director of public safety and when are you police chief?
There really isn't a distinction.
Okay.
I do both all of the time. I mean, there's a great fire chief that we have here who, from an operational perspective, manages the fire department. I'm dealing with budgetary concerns, staffing models, futuristic ideas in order to improve the level of service that we provide. And then as the police chief, through state statute, there are certain obligations that I have to adhere to in order for our department to have a functioning police department. So I'm kind of wearing both hats simultaneously. Well, I'm not kind of, I am wearing both hats simultaneously.
What drew you to want to join the police force in the first place? Had you always known you wanted to be a police officer?
Yeah, for the most part. As a little kid, I played cops and robbers, and I was usually the cop. And I had an admiration for the job that they, did. And again, my real exposure at that time was what we all saw on television and in the movies, which is really not anything like the real job. But I had an uncle when I was growing up who volunteered his time with the Coon Rapids Police Department and with the Anoka County Sheriff's Office. And so he got me interested into what the career could potentially provide. And so, all the way through, I'd say junior high school, that was kind of the direction I thought I was headed. But then my interest in it waned, and I thought about some different career options, including, becoming a lawyer, or I was really interested in aviation. And when I was a senior in high school, I was, preparing to go to college out of state. I had a couple of different destinations in mind and kind of a different career trajectory in mind. And when I was, again, a senior, in order to get an A in our social studies class, you had to have so many hours of community involvement or community service. And long story short, I learned about this program at the police department where you could get credit for doing ride-alongs. And I thought, well, that's a good way to earn an A. So I called up and learned pretty quickly it was more than just riding along. It was an actual program it's called Exploring through the Boy Scouts of America to really explore a profession, an occupation, or in my case, I'll call it a vocation. And through that exploration, I made a pretty fast decision that, yep, this is what I see myself doing. So I had to alter my college plans and then ended up attending at that time the College of St. Thomas, now the University of St. Thomas, to get my undergraduate work so that I could be a police officer here in Minnesota. So that's how I fell into it. After my first ride along, I was hooked and thought, oh my gosh, I can't believe they get paid to do this. And it's exactly what I wanted to do. And to this day, I still get to go out and do it, even though I have the role of police chief and public safety director. Nothing brings me more joy than getting back into a squad car and going out into the field and taking calls for service. It's to me, it's an absolute blast.
Are there any specifically Jewish values that you take with you from growing up into your job as police chief?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's you look at the foundational principles that all of us, I hope, have, in their background that help them kind of set their course on life. And, I learned early on from, my grandparents and other relatives, and certainly my immediate family, my parents and siblings, the value of education, the value of making a difference in the world, right? Tikkun olam, right? I mean, it's about, giving back. We're very fortunate to have our health and to have a job and to have a home and food on the table. And so I think that, we're called to do this work. It's not easy work to do. Clearly now it's not. And, but it's worthwhile. It's meaningful, and it brings something, to people's lives that if we weren't here to bring it, they wouldn't have it. So, it's incredibly important. It's honorable work. And I do believe that in the way I was raised, because my parents were always involved in different charitable events. They still are to this day. And so, is my sister, and it's just a part of who we are as a family. I just happen to turn it into, a vocation. But it's one that I take a lot of pride in and I've had a lot of fun with.
So one of the great gifts from the Plymouth Police Department to the Twin Cities Jewish community has been your former deputy, Dan Pleckenpole, leaving Plymouth to go work for the Jewish Community Relations Council. Now, I think it's a gift, or were you just pleased to get rid of him?
No,
Okay.
I laugh, but no. Dan was a gift to our organization, and I know he's doing wonderful work for the JCRC. Dan is an incredibly talented individual who is caring and smart and very well connected, particularly in what we call the emergency management world. He understands all of the different elements of safety and security needs for organizations, whether it's in the law enforcement realm or now serving within the construct of the JCRC. He has, I think, brought information and planning mechanisms into play that never existed before to help safeguard the Jewish community and Jewish interests. And we should all be very grateful for his talents and expertise because we're in a better place today than we were prior to him coming into that role.
Well, he is great, and now I'm afraid he's gonna be unbearable now that you've said all those really nice things about him.
Yeah, well, I have all of the dirty secrets that I can reveal at any moment in time to bring them back down if needed. So,
Excellent. I'm gonna keep that in mind and call you if I need to.
yeah, absolutely, not a problem.
Excellent. Last two questions, and we'll let you get back to you to the rest of your day. What is your favorite Jewish holiday?
Oh, that's a hard one. My goodness. Well, to be honest, well, not that I wouldn't be. You know, I guess it's the high holidays, and I don't distinguish, I guess, between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur because they're so tightly
Sure.
tied together. I like the fact that it's solemn. It allows me at least time to, in essence, even though I'm there with family, to be alone in the synagogue to reflect. And I find it to be very calming and peaceful. Typically, the other holidays, there's family and there's a little bit more chaos involved, whether it's, Hanukkah or Passover. You got, the Seder going on. And in our family, there's lots of commotion. And so, and I don't mean that in a bad way. There's just a lot going on.
Yeah.
And it's fun to interact and exchange and all those things with folks during those celebratory times. But I think the high holidays, number one, because of the meaning behind them. And number two, just the time to kind of find peace and become a little bit more restored.
That's excellent. And yeah, absolutely. Passover, Hanukkah, they get very chaotic. So
Yeah.
that's it's a little tough to be contemplative in those holidays. And what is your favorite Jewish food?
Oh, potato knish. Yeah, knish. My mom and my grandmas, both of them, they knocked it out of the park. So I guess that is my favorite food, a Jewish food. Yeah, for sure. And I don't get them enough, but I do like them a lot.
No, excellent choice. You cannot go wrong with those.
Yeah.
Well, Plymouth Police Chief and Director of Public Safety, Mike Goldstein, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation, for enlightening us, and I look forward to seeing if maybe some of the larger departments will pick up on some of the reforms and or use Plymouth as a model for some of the reforms that could be, because I think you're doing a lot of really good things in the city that should be looked at around at other departments.
Well, I appreciate your thoughts on that, and it was my pleasure to be with you today, and look forward to future opportunities down the road. So thank you very much.
Thank you. The Who the Folk podcast is part of the Jew Folk Podcast Network, a product of Jew Folk Inc. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you have suggestions for other podcast guests, please email them to me at editor@tcjewfolk.com. For our other shows, check out tcjewfolk.com/podcast.